Dear friends, today we have with us the globally renowned scientist, historian, as well as Hindu scholar, Dr. Subhash Kak. Dr. Kak, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pallavi. Glad to be on your show.
Dr. Kak, let's start with zero, the number. Now, zero was invented in India by the Hindu sages. So, if you could take us through the story of how and when zero was invented and how the invention of zero actually changed humanity in terms of the impact it had on mathematics and science.
Well, there are different kinds of evidences. First of all, is inscriptional evidence, and I think the earliest ones are in Gwalior and also in Cambodia, where in a certain inscription there is a date which has a zero in it. But that apart, if you go back to the earliest texts, the Indians had very or mention of very large numbers, going back to the Yajurveda and so on, huge numbers. And clearly, there was a fascination with size and with chronology and with long periods. And in that representation, it becomes very efficient if you're using a zero. Now, it's not quite clear whether zero was used explicitly when these texts were recorded, but there is a certain piece of evidence that I proposed many, many years ago. I said, look, often a scientific discovery leads to philosophical reinterpretation or philosophical elaboration. And the idea of shunyata in Buddhism came about 50 CE, 50 BC to 50 CE. So I argued that possibly that was the time that the symbol for zero was used explicitly in math, although conceptually it was already a part of the Indian tradition, because you also have binary numbers. As you all know, binary numbers means where there are only two symbols, zeros and ones, and they are normally credited to Leibniz or sometime somewhat a European scholar in the 1720s. I believe it's Leibniz. But binary numbers were already in use in India in about 200 or 300 BCE. And this is Pingala's Chanda Shastra, where he argued that chandas, which are these meters of which are used in music or in hymns or in poetry or in prosody, they are best represented in sequences of zeros and ones, which he called Laghu and Guru. So the idea of zero was already there. And he showed how they could also be labeled as 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Because if you have six binary digits that take you to 2 to the power 6, which is 64. So the idea of zero, therefore, was already there in almost all forms. And the inscriptional evidence also suggests the early centuries CE. And then, if you go back to its later history, it was reintroduced into Europe by Fibonacci, who translated a Arabic book on Indian mathematics. I think it was about 1100 or 1200s. And what's fascinating is that there was a huge reaction to it. Because along with zero also came negative numbers, because they were a part of Indian mathematics going back to Brahmagupta. And there was a huge reaction from the church. They said, no, these are devilish, negative numbers should not be allowed. So it was several centuries before all of this Indian mathematics was introduced, was accepted or incorporated into European mathematics.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, the mathematician was Al-Khwarizmi. If I'm not mistaken, he was the mathematician. And so, even if we take the more, I would say the more conservative estimates, even by the history written by colonialist, the history that is still being taught around the world, even by those accounts, one can argue that that the invention of zero happened in India, in the sense that, as you mentioned, that the book that Al-Khwarizmi wrote was a book on Indian numbers, on Hindu numbers.
Oh, absolutely. Al-Khwarizmi translated Indian mathematics. That's why it was called Al-Hind, or Hindasa. Numerals are called Hindasa, which means Indian numerals. So they went into Arabic through him, and via Fibonacci. Fibonacci translated one of these later books, which he found in Morocco, into Latin. So that was, I was talking about the latter part of the story. But you're right. It was the translation of Indian mathematics into Arabic was done earlier by Al-Khwarizmi. And in fact, I think the word algorithm comes from there. And of course, the Arabs have always called it Indian numerals, or Hindasa, that is the Indian numerals. And now, since the Europeans um, got their mathematics through the Arabs, originally from India, they started calling it Arabic numerals. Now, of late, there are people who are saying that they should be called at least Hindu Arabic numerals, or just Indian numerals. So I think it depends upon mathematicians. And as you know, mathematicians are very conservative. And if there's a certain usage, nobody wants to change that, because there is, a lot of investment. And so it can only be done at a national level, or if there were texts in India which were to start using Indian numerals. I think they do. School books in India now use Indian numerals, but elsewhere uh, in the West, it's still either Arabic numerals or less frequently Hindu Arabic numerals.
Yeah. And just to let our viewers know here that, the numericals that we are mentioning are the 1 to 9 and 0 that are used worldwide today. So the origin of these numbers is, of course, India. And then they were used by the Arab mathematicians who, again, if I'm not mistaken, have written that they switched to the Hindu numbers because it was more convenient. It was easier to make calculations in them. And because the Europeans got it through them, they classified them as Arabic, or now Hindu Arabic numbers, even though the Arabs themselves have never claimed so.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Yeah, that's the story. That zero was invented in India. There is all kind of evidence, inscriptional, philosophical. The idea of shunyata, as a very powerful idea in Buddhism. Shunyata meaning zero-ness. And prior to that, binary numbers, Pingala's Chanda Shastra, which is centuries BCE. So all of this really the foundation of representation of numbers and mathematics goes back to India. Now, of course, when we are talking of zero, we are only talking the symbol zero, but algebraic manipulation using negative numbers also goes back to India. Brahmagupta, which is about 600 CE, about 1400 years ago. So he came down with all the rules that are a part of standard mathematics now.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Kak, how did these numbers, how did these Indian inventions or Indian mathematics, how did it go on to influence the world, and the impact that it had going forward in almost all of the sciences that we know today?
Well, two sides to it. One is, of course, the ease of representing of data. Because if you don't use zero, if you use Roman numerals, for example, it's not convenient at all. You have to represent 100 as L, uh, and 1000 at C, or is it the other way around? I forget. So even moderately large numbers require many many digits, so it's not convenient at all. And modern mathematics requires precise computations, specification in decimals, and that could not have been possible without Indian numbers. But as I said, going back to Yajurveda itself, there were huge numbers used. Indians have been in love with numbers, both large and small, for a very, very long time.